The air in the medieval city was always heavy, not just with the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and horse dung, but with the weight of danger. You felt it in your bones the moment you woke, if you managed to sleep at all. Being an assassin was not a profession. It was a slow, deliberate walk toward your own grave. Every heartbeat carried the echo of a possible last one. Every step down a cobblestone alley felt like a coin toss between survival and death. You lived inside the shadow of your own demise, and the shadow never shrank. It followed you in the tavern when you pretended to drink to blend in. It sat beside you on cold church pews when you sought to overhear whispers of contracts. And it loomed over you even in daylight, where the narrow streets funneled sound and made every bootstep behind you feel like a hunter closing in. You became an expert in recognizing the quiet moments before danger. A sudden stillness in the market crowd, the way two men exchanged a glance and then looked away too quickly, the deliberate clinking of armor somewhere behind you. It was never coincidence. The human body learns to live in constant tension, your ears straining to catch the sound of a blade being drawn, your eyes memorizing every possible escape route. The danger wasn't only from your enemies. Sometimes it came from those who had hired you. A job well done was never a guarantee of safety. Often, the more efficient you were, the more they feared you. And fear in a medieval lord could turn to paranoia. Paranoia could turn to an order for your execution before your name had even spread beyond the city walls. Before you go, take a moment to join this story. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, and tell me in the comments what time it is where you're watching from. I want to imagine each of you in your own corner of the world hearing these words as the clock ticks in your city, your village, or your street. The church bells marked the hours, but they didn't mark time for you. They marked survival checkpoints. If you were still alive at the sound of the evening bells, it meant you'd lasted another day. Yet nightfall was never comforting. Darkness did not hide you. It made you a silhouette against the faint glow of torchlight, an easier mark for an arrow loosed from a rooftop. Even the moonlight could betray you, casting your shadow into view before you appeared. You moved like a ghost, but without a ghost's luxury of being untouchable. And when the wind carried the sound of dogs barking in the distance, it could mean they'd caught your scent, trained to hunt the condemned before the morning sun could reveal your corpse to the city. Every assassination, every blade you drove into another man's flesh, brought you closer to the day someone would do the same to you. You could see it in the eyes of your targets during their final moments. A mix of shock, rage, and a desperate need to know why. That look haunted you, not because of guilt, but because you knew that one day you'd be the one on the receiving end of it. In the medieval world, killers rarely died in bed. They died in the street, in a prison cell, or on a scaffold with a rope biting into their neck. And unlike the romanticized versions sung by traveling bards, there was no glory in it. No epic tale for the common folk, no mercy from the law, no noble cause to justify the act. You began to live in fragments of time, avoiding patterns that could be tracked. Never eating in the same place twice, never using the same alley 2 nights in a row, never letting the same woman see your face more than once. Even kindness became a liability. If someone cared for you, they could be tortured for your whereabouts. This made you an island, cut off from any real human connection, surviving only by keeping the rest of the world at arm's length. But isolation was its own kind of torment. The human voice became something you heard mostly from strangers, often right before you silenced it forever. The thought of death didn't scare you as much as the way it would happen. Quick death was a mercy. Slow death, public, humiliating, designed to make an example of you was the more likely end. The city square was not just a place for trade, but for executions, where the crowd's laughter could be crueler than the executioner's blade. You had walked past that raised wooden platform enough times to know the smell of fear mixed with blood, the way people craned their necks to get a better look at the condemned. Sometimes you caught the eyes of prisoners as they waited their turn, and in those eyes you saw a mirror of your own fate. Every time you stepped into a contract, you were not just accepting the risk of being caught, you were daring fate to finally claim you. And fate, in a world like that, never forgot a name, no matter how carefully you tried to erase it. The more your reputation grew in whispers and shadows, the louder the unspoken truth became. One day, someone faster, smarter, or luckier would find you. And when they did, they wouldn't just end your life. They'd erase your existence as if you had never walked those cobblestones, never taken those lives, never breathed that cold, damp air. Yet you kept walking, because in this world, standing still was an invitation for death to catch up, and death never needed a second invitation. Working for a medieval lord was like placing your neck beneath a blade and waiting for the right excuse for it to drop. These men could be generous with their gold when you served their interests, but they were just as quick to spill your blood if they so much as suspected betrayal. Loyalty in this world was not a bond, it was a leash, and the hand holding that leash belonged to someone who could, at any moment, decide that you had outlived your usefulness. Lords were rarely the gallant figures from courtly tales. They were ambitious, paranoid, and often desperate to maintain their power, which made them dangerous employers for someone whose trade was murder. When you were summoned to a great hall to receive an order, the air felt thick with unspoken threats. The stone walls carried the echoes of boots and armor. The firelight flickered in ways that made shadows dance along the walls, and every servant in the room knew better than to meet your eyes. The Lord would lean forward on his chair, his voice low, as if the request he was about to make needed to be kept between the two of you, even though everyone present knew what you were. He might speak of honor, of removing an obstacle for the good of the realm, but beneath the polite words was a command to kill. And even as you accepted the task, you knew the very act of doing it might make you too dangerous to keep alive afterward. Payment was never guaranteed, and when it came, it could be a trap. A pouch of coins could carry a note to the city guard naming you as the killer, or worse, an order for your arrest. Some lords paid in favors, an empty promise of protection that would vanish the moment they were questioned by the church or another noble. Others would pay lavishly at first, giving you a false sense of security, only to later claim you had stolen from them, justifying your execution. In their minds, a dead assassin couldn't blackmail them, couldn't spill secrets, and couldn't be used by a rival. The moment you accepted their gold, you became a liability they were already calculating how to remove. There were no safe employers, only those who hadn't yet decided to kill you. One week, you might be the invisible hand that removed a political threat. The next, you could be standing accused of treason, your name whispered in the corridors of the castle by the very man who hired you. This was especially true during times of unrest, when alliances shifted daily and yesterday's ally could be tomorrow's enemy. A rival noble might discover your involvement in a killing and offer your lord a bargain, your life, in exchange for peace. And more often than not, the bargain was taken. Your survival depended on reading your employer as carefully as you read your targets. You learned to watch their eyes, to measure their silences, to note which words they didn't say. A lord who smiled too warmly after a job was often the one already planning your end. They would call you friend or brother, share wine with you, perhaps even invite you to a feast. But such gestures were not trust. They were theater, and you were the audience, unaware you were also part of the act. The halls of their castles were never yours to walk freely. Every step you took inside was under the eyes of guards whose loyalty was bought and sealed with the promise of killing you if commanded. The kitchens could be poison traps, the guest chambers fitted with locks that latched from the outside. Sleeping under a lord's roof meant gambling with the hope that your throat wouldn't be slit by one of his men while you dreamed. Even the gifts they gave you, a fine dagger, a heavy cloak, a horse, were not necessarily tokens of gratitude. A dagger could be traced back to you in a crime you didn't commit. A cloak could be dyed in colors that marked you to your enemies. A horse could carry you swiftly into an ambush. The cruelest irony was that you were bound to these men by necessity. Without their contracts, you had no income, no influence, no protection from the law. They were your employers, but also your jailers, holding you in a prison without walls. You could try to disappear, to vanish into another region, but lords had long memories and longer reaches. Word traveled faster than you could ride, and a bounty on your head could follow you across kingdoms. Some assassins attempted to play the lords against each other, taking jobs from rival houses and hoping the balance of power kept them alive. But in the long run, it only made things worse. Once a lord suspected you had worked for his enemy, there was no chance of redemption. Every mission you completed was both proof of your skill and an argument for why you needed to be eliminated before you could turn it against the one who hired you. The most dangerous moment was not before a job, it was after. You'd return with the news that the target had been dealt with, expecting payment or praise, and instead find the atmosphere colder, the stares more lingering. A single wrong word, a hesitation, could make them decide you were no longer worth the risk. And when a lord decided you were a threat, your death was swift and certain. No warning, no chance to plead, just a final summons to the great hall that you would never leave alive. And so, each contract was a knife with two edges, one aimed at your target, the other poised to turn back on you. The more work you took, the more you sharpened the blade against yourself. Yet refusing a job was just as dangerous, a silent insult to a man who expected obedience. In a world ruled by such men, there was no safe choice, only the illusion of it. And illusions, as you were constantly reminded, could vanish in a heartbeat. Improvised weapons were the assassin's constant companions, not because they were preferred, but because they were often the only choice. In a world where carrying a finely crafted sword could draw suspicion and mark you for arrest, subtlety became your deadliest blade. You could not walk openly with the tools of your trade. Instead, you learned to hide death in plain sight. A dagger disguised as a kitchen knife, a garrote woven from the strands of a leather belt, a vial of poison small enough to fit inside a hollowed-out coin. Each object was both ordinary and lethal, the difference lying entirely in the hands that wielded it. The beauty and danger of such tools was their unpredictability. A blacksmith's hammer could crush a man's skull as easily as it could shape iron. A carpenter's chisel, sharpened just right, could pierce through chainmail in the gap between rings. Even something as simple as a jug of boiling water lifted from a kitchen fire could end a life before a guard had time to draw his sword. This resourcefulness was not a mark of creativity. It was a necessity, born from the constant threat of searches, confiscations, and the prying eyes of those who suspected your trade. You learned quickly that the most effective weapons were often the ones no one thought to take from you. A tailor's needle could slip between ribs if pushed with enough force. A length of rope used to tie down a cart could become a noose in an alleyway. A brick from a crumbling wall, loosened and dropped from above, could kill without ever revealing the hand that sent it. In the chaos of medieval streets, where markets overflowed with goods and crowds moved like restless tides, anything could become a weapon if you understood its potential. Yet improvisation came with its own set of risks. A weapon you made yourself could fail you at the worst possible moment. A poorly balanced blade might glance off bone instead of cutting deep. A poison mixed hastily could fail to kill, or worse, betray its presence before it took effect. There were no guarantees, and the cost of failure was often your own life. The pressure to be precise, to craft and test your tools in secrecy, was constant. Every strike had to be calculated, every object tested for its silence, speed, and concealment. The deadliest tools were often those that worked slowly. A pinch of powdered belladonna in a goblet of wine could bring down a man in hours, leaving no clear suspect. But slow kills came with a cruel patience. You had to watch your target after the deed was done, blending into the background as the poison began its work. Sometimes you would sit at a nearby table pretending to eat as the man across the room grew pale, clutched his stomach, and finally collapsed into his own feast. You never celebrated these kills. You simply walked away before the commotion began, leaving the blame to fall on some unlucky cook or servant. Improvised weapons also made you unpredictable to your enemies. They could search you from head to toe and find nothing that seemed dangerous. That was the advantage. You weren't bound to a single method of killing. One night, it could be a blade in the dark, the next a fall down a flight of stone stairs, the next an accidental fire in a straw-roofed room. Your methods were as varied as the tools you used, and this kept your pursuers guessing. But it also meant you lived in a constant state of reinvention, never relying too long on one trick, never letting anyone see a pattern they could exploit. The streets themselves became an arsenal if you knew how to read them. Loose stones could trip a man at just the right moment, sending him sprawling into the path of a horse. Barrels could be rolled into alleys to block escape routes. A candle placed carefully near a tapestry could start a blaze that drove your target exactly where you wanted him to go. Every shadow, every corner, every object in your path was a potential tool if you had the nerve to use it. But with every improvised weapon came the haunting truth. You could never be entirely sure of the outcome. A swing might miss, a poison might be detected, a fall might wound instead of kill, leaving you face to face with an enemy now aware of your intent. There were no second chances in this line of work. The margin between success and disaster was razor thin, and you lived every moment in that dangerous space, where the next move could make you a ghost or a corpse. It was this constant uncertainty that made the work so intoxicating for some and unbearable for others. Every kill was a test, a measure of your wit, skill, and adaptability. And yet, with every improvised strike, you left behind another clue, another chance for someone to trace the act back to you. The very tools that kept you alive could also be the ones that signed your death warrant. Still, you carried on, because in the medieval world, you could not afford to be unarmed, not even for a moment. The same streets that offered you the tools of death were filled with those who would gladly use them against you. And in a trade where trust was a myth and safety a fleeting illusion, the only constant was that every object, no matter how harmless it seemed, had the potential to kill, or to be the last thing you ever touched. Being hunted was not an occasional risk, it was a constant state of existence. The moment you accepted the life of an assassin, you were marked. Somewhere, someone was always looking for you, whether it was the city guard, bounty hunters, rival killers, or the families of those you had dispatched. The medieval world had no shortage of people willing to track and kill for a price, and the coin offered for your head was often higher than anything you ever earned for taking one. To live in such a world meant you could never walk without feeling eyes on your back, never eat without glancing over your shoulder, never sleep without one hand on a weapon. The guards were the most relentless. They did not operate with the subtlety of assassins, but their persistence made them dangerous. In cities, their patrols were predictable, but they knew every alley, every shortcut, every dead end where a fugitive could be cornered. In rural areas, they traveled in mounted units, covering miles of open land with ease, hunting fugitives like wolves tracking wounded prey. The sound of clanking armor and the creak of leather straps became as ominous as the tolling of a funeral bell. Even if you escaped their sight, their network of informants could betray you for a single silver coin. A barmaid, a stable boy, a market vendor. Anyone could be the mouth that whispered your location into a guard's ear. Then there were the bounty hunters. Unlike guards, they were not bound by rules or honor. They were predators who thrived in the gray areas of morality, using whatever means necessary to capture their quarry. They studied you, learned your habits, your favorite taverns, the routes you took when the streets grew too crowded. Some would even shadow you for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, letting you grow comfortable before pouncing. The best of them could make you feel safe right up until the cold bite of steel pressed against your throat. Rival assassins were an entirely different threat. They knew your tricks because they used them themselves. They could anticipate your movements, predict your hiding places, and exploit your weaknesses with surgical precision. Sometimes they hunted you not for coin, but for reputation. Killing a well-known assassin was a way to climb the invisible hierarchy of the underworld. These were the most dangerous encounters, for they carried the same skills you did, but without the burden of defending themselves from you in the same moment. One mistake, one miscalculation, and you could find yourself staring into the eyes of someone who was not just your enemy, but your reflection. Even the victims you left behind had their own hunters, brothers seeking vengeance, sons carrying the weight of family honor, fathers who would cross kingdoms to spill your blood in retribution. These were not professionals. They did not think like assassins, but their raw emotion made them unpredictable. They could appear anywhere, at any time, with no regard for their own safety, willing to die if it meant taking you with them. That kind of desperation was almost impossible to defend against because you could not bribe it, intimidate it, or talk it away. The psychological toll of being hunted was its own form of slow death. Your mind never rested. Every shadow became a possible threat. Every stranger's glance carried the weight of suspicion. Sleep was shallow and fractured, haunted by the thought of waking to the glint of a blade in the dark. You learned to move constantly, to change cities, to never stay in one place long enough for a hunter to close in. Yet the more you moved, the more you stood out. A lone traveler with no clear destination was often the very image of a fugitive. The terrain itself could turn against you. In the tight, twisting streets of a medieval city, a wrong turn could trap you in a cul-de-sac with no escape. In the countryside, open fields left you exposed to archers and mounted pursuers. Forests provided cover, but also concealment for those stalking you. Even the weather could betray you. Fresh snow revealed your tracks. Heavy rain slowed your movement. Fog distorted shapes until friend and foe looked alike. Survival depended on knowing how to use the land as both shield and weapon, to vanish into the environment before your hunters could corner you. And then there was the paranoia that came with never knowing how close your pursuers truly were. You could pass through a market and brush shoulders with the very man sent to kill you without realizing it until it was too late. You might drink from a cup not knowing it had been poisoned hours before. You could be walking down a street when a loose tile fell from a rooftop, and you'd never know if it was an accident or an attempt on your life. The truth was brutal. You could never truly escape the hunt. You could only delay it, sidestep it, confuse it for a while. Every hunter you evaded today could become tomorrow's employer for someone else, hiring them to finish the job. And one day, inevitably, one of them would succeed. In this profession, survival was never a permanent state. It was borrowed time, and the debt collector was always on your trail. Dying alone was not the fear, it was the certainty. In the life of a medieval assassin, there was no expectation of a dignified death surrounded by loved ones, no priest whispering final prayers, no legacy preserved in the stories of grateful allies. You existed in the shadows, and that was exactly where you would vanish. The city would not stop when your blood seeped into its cobblestones. No one would mourn you openly, and no one would carve your name into stone. You would be swept away as if you had never existed, erased by silence and indifference. The end could come anywhere, an unlit alley where the rats got to you before dawn, the bottom of a muddy ditch where rain disguised the blood, the back room of a tavern where no one asked questions. Sometimes the body was never found at all. In the countryside, the wolves might scatter your bones before any soul stumbled upon them. In the city, the scavenger crews that cleaned the streets would haul you away with the same indifference they showed to the beggars who froze to death in winter. To them, you were not a person, just another corpse to clear before the market opened. Even those you thought might care for you were powerless, or unwilling to give you any dignity in death. A friend might be too afraid to claim your body for fear of being associated with you. A lover might weep in private, but could not risk their own life by showing public grief. In a world where execution was a spectacle, grief itself was dangerous. And so you became another unclaimed body, buried in a pit with criminals, plague victims, and the forgotten. The earth did not care who you were or what you had done. It swallowed you all the same. The lack of glory was not just in death, but in life itself. No bard would sing of you in the taverns. No scribe would write your deeds in the annals of history. If your name was remembered at all, it would be in the curses of those you had wronged, or in the warnings whispered to children about what happens to those who walk the path you chose. You might imagine yourself a figure of legend while you still drew breath. But legends require witnesses, and assassins were condemned to live unseen. There was a cruel irony in the fact that the most skilled killers often died in the most unremarkable ways. A man who had slipped into fortresses, outwitted guards, and taken the lives of nobles could be felled by a drunk with a lucky swing in a crowded street. A woman who had poisoned kings might die from a fever contracted in a filthy lodging house. In the end, the manner of death rarely matched the danger of the life, and the final moment was rarely the dramatic climax of a well-told story. It was quiet, abrupt, and indifferent. Sometimes the only people who noticed your absence were those who wanted you gone. A rival might toast your demise. A lord might breathe easier knowing you could no longer spill his secrets. Even the guilds or networks you once served would not risk avenging you. Dead assassins could not fulfill contracts, and their deaths were simply the cost of doing business. In truth, the moment you could no longer deliver value, you were as good as dead already in the eyes of the underworld. This knowledge weighed heavily on every choice you made. It made you cautious, but it also made you reckless at times, because when the inevitable end was so certain, what was there to fear? Some assassins sought one final grand act, a kill so daring it would be impossible to ignore, hoping that it might grant them some small slice of immortality in whispers and rumors. Most failed, their deaths overshadowing whatever feat they attempted. The world forgot them just the same. The idea of dying alone was not just about physical isolation, it was about erasure. Your skills, your cunning, your survival, none of it mattered if it left no trace. You could spend years shaping yourself into a phantom feared by all, only to dissolve into nothing when the right blade found you. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest truth of all. In the medieval world, anonymity was your greatest weapon, but also your final curse. And so you lived with a constant awareness that every breath, every job, every narrow escape was a step toward that lonely, unmarked grave. It made the air feel heavier, the streets darker, the silence more oppressive. The world would not remember you, and yet you kept moving through it, carving a path that would vanish the moment you fell. You survived, not for glory, but because survival was all there was, until the day survival ended. No reward was ever worth the risk. That was the truth that sat in the back of your mind every time you stepped into the shadows for another contract. The gold glittered temptingly when the purse landed in your hand, but it was never enough to erase the danger, never enough to guarantee safety, never enough to buy your way out of the life. A bag of coins could feed you for a few weeks, bribe a guard, or buy you a horse, but it could not protect you from the blade in the dark or the noose in the square. The wealth of an assassin was always temporary, and so was the life that earned it. Most payments came in secrecy, a small pouch passed under a tavern table or left in a hidden place only you and your employer knew. But secrecy came with a price. Sometimes, when you arrived at the agreed spot, the gold would be there, along with armed men waiting to ensure you never spent it. Other times, the payment itself was poisoned with suspicion. Each coin could have been marked, each gem a signal to anyone who recognized it that you had been involved in a killing. You could not flaunt the money you made. Spending too much in one place was as good as announcing your profession to the entire city. The irony was that the most dangerous jobs were often the lowest paying. If the target was well guarded or politically powerful, the cost of getting close enough to strike could far outweigh the reward. You might have to bribe multiple informants, acquire rare poisons, or travel for days, all while paying for food, shelter, and the silence of those who saw you pass. By the time the job was done, the payment might barely cover the cost of surviving long enough to complete it. And if the job failed, there was no second half of the payment, only the certainty that someone would now be hunting you. Some lords and wealthy merchants liked to promise extravagant rewards, land, titles, immunity from the law, but these were lies meant to bind you to them until the task was done. Once you had delivered the kill, the promise dissolved like smoke. At best, they might toss you an extra handful of silver. At worst, they would kill you themselves to avoid having to pay at all. You learned quickly that contracts in your line of work were written in words, but enforced in blood. Even the guilds, if you worked for one, took their share. They claimed it was for your protection, for maintaining safe houses and bribing officials, but you knew the truth. They were simply another layer of the system that kept you trapped. You could not refuse their cut, and you could not work outside their control without risking their wrath. Independent assassins had no guild protection, which meant no backup when a job went wrong and no place to run when the law closed in. And yet, guild protection was an illusion anyway. If your death served the guild's interests, they would hand you over to the executioner without hesitation. The weight of this truth changed the way you looked at every coin. They were not rewards. They were risks solidified into metal. Each one represented someone who now had reason to see you dead. Every job you accepted increased the number of people who might want vengeance, who might hire someone faster or stronger to erase you. And the more gold you collected, the heavier that invisible bounty on your head became. It was common to hear stories in the underworld of assassins who died rich, but in truth, they almost never existed. The ones who survived long enough to accumulate wealth either disappeared entirely, faking their deaths and vanishing into distant lands, or they were betrayed before they could enjoy a single day of peace. The taverns whispered of one man who saved for years, hiding his gold under the floorboards of a rented room, only to be murdered in his sleep by the landlord who had discovered his hoard. Another assassin, a woman famed for her precision, was promised a fortune in jewels for a single, high-profile kill. She received them, but less than a month later her body was found floating in the river, her fingers broken and the jewels gone. And yet, despite all this, you kept taking the work. The illusion of reward was hard to resist, especially in a world where other professions paid in scraps and offered no escape from poverty. A lifetime of hunger could make a man risk anything for a single feast. A childhood of squalor could make a woman gamble her life for a silk dress she might wear only once. The danger was part of the bargain. You told yourself it was worth it, even when every job pushed you closer to the end. But deep down, you knew the truth that every assassin eventually faced. The gold you earned would never be enough to buy safety, nor enough to buy back the years spent in fear. No amount of payment could erase the blood from your hands, and no reward could truly free you from the cycle. In the end, you weren't working for wealth. You were working to survive another day, and the payment, no matter how heavy in your hand, was just a reminder that your next job might be your last. Life in the shadows was not just a choice, it was the only way to stay alive. As an assassin in the medieval world, your existence was built on invisibility. You didn't just avoid the public eye, you erased yourself from it. You became a figure who slipped through crowded markets without leaving a trace, who could pass a neighbor in the street without being remembered 5 minutes later. The shadows weren't a refuge. They were your home, your armor, and your prison all at once. You learned early that the less people knew you existed, the longer you lived. That meant cutting ties with family, even those who had done you no harm, because their loyalty could be broken under the weight of torture. Friends were dangerous luxuries, lovers even more so. Every personal connection was a possible crack in the wall you built around yourself, a path for hunters to follow straight to your door. And in your profession, a door was rarely kicked down to deliver good news. Shelter was never permanent. You shifted from one dingy room to another, always paying in cash, never giving a name, never staying long enough for the smell of your cooking to become familiar to the neighbors. In rural villages, you might sleep in barns or abandoned watchtowers, where the only witnesses to your presence were rats and the wind. In cities, you hid among the forgotten, beggars, vagrants, night workers, blending into the parts of society that polite citizens pretended not to see. The streets at night were your true domain. The way the light from a torch barely reached beyond its own circle, the way the mist curled around corners, the way even the bravest guards kept to the main roads after dark. All of it worked in your favor. You knew which alleys swallowed sound, which rooftops offered safe passage, which sewer grates led to networks that could take you across the city without ever touching open ground. In those hours between midnight and dawn, you moved like a rumor, something half real that vanished before anyone could be sure they had seen it. But living in the shadows was not without its costs. You became invisible to more than just your enemies. You became invisible to the world itself. You could pass a starving child and know that feeding them would put you at risk, because generosity meant engagement, and engagement meant exposure. You could watch a fire break out in a crowded market and walk away without helping, because lingering meant witnesses, and witnesses meant danger. In time, you began to feel less human, more like a wraith, passing through a world you could touch but never truly be part of. Even the way you carried yourself had to change. You avoided moving with urgency unless it was absolutely necessary. Running drew attention, but so did standing still too long. Your gaze stayed low, your shoulders slightly hunched, your steps quiet and measured. You dressed not to impress, but to disappear, wearing colors that faded into the background and fabrics that didn't catch the light. And when you spoke, if you spoke at all, your voice was calm and unremarkable, the kind that drifted out of memory almost as soon as it was heard. There was an art to being unseen. In crowded spaces, you stayed on the edges, never at the center. You let others' noise cover your movements, timing your steps to coincide with the clatter of carts or the laughter of drunks. In emptier spaces, you made yourself part of the landscape, leaning casually against a wall as if you belonged there, or pretending to study a shop display as someone passed. The goal was not just to avoid notice, it was to become so ordinary that anyone who saw you would forget you moments later. But shadows could be as dangerous as they were protective. In the dark, you could not always see who was behind you. In the alleys, another blade could be waiting just out of sight. The same corners you used to vanish could be used by your enemies to set an ambush. And when you lived in that constant twilight between safety and exposure, you never truly rested. Every whisper of movement, every flicker in the torchlight, every shadow that shifted in ways it shouldn't could be the beginning of your end. The worst part was that the shadows began to change you. The longer you lived in them, the more they clung to you, until even in daylight you felt like a creature apart. People sensed it, though they could not name it. They might step aside without knowing why, or glance at you and then quickly look away. You became not just unseen, but unwanted, a presence that unsettled even those who didn't know who you were. And yet, you stayed there. Because the moment you stepped fully into the light, you were exposed. And exposure meant the hunt would begin again, not in whispers, but in open pursuit. The shadows might be cold, lonely, and suffocating, but they were still the only place left where you could draw another breath and know it wouldn't be your last. Torture was not an abstract threat for a medieval assassin. It was a near certainty if you were caught. The justice of the time was not built to investigate crimes through logic or evidence. It was built to break bodies and minds until they gave the answers the authorities wanted, whether those answers were true or not. And for someone in your profession, they would not stop at the truth. They would keep going until they had wrung every name, every location, every whispered rumor you had ever heard out of you, and then they would push further, just to see how much pain a human body could endure before it fell silent forever. The methods were as varied as they were brutal. Racks that stretched limbs until joints tore apart. Iron boots filled with wedges that crushed bones slowly, making every heartbeat another hammer blow of agony. Thumbscrews that could turn the smallest part of your body into a focal point of unbearable pain. Water torture, where bucket after bucket was poured over your face until your body believed it was drowning over and over again. Some punishments were designed not to kill quickly, but to keep you alive for as long as possible, because the point wasn't to end you, it was to hollow you out until there was nothing left inside worth saving. And it wasn't just the pain, it was the humiliation. The guards and executioners knew that stripping away dignity was as effective as breaking bones. You would be chained in public, paraded through the streets, so the crowd could spit on you and throw whatever they could find. They would cheer at every scream, convinced that your suffering was justice, even if they didn't know who you truly were or what you had actually done. The spectacle made you less than human in their eyes, a lesson to others about what happened to those who lived outside the law. The interrogations were rarely about finding justice. They were about securing power. If a lord wanted your network destroyed, you would be pushed until you named your contacts, whether those names were true or invented in desperation. If a rival wanted to claim credit for taking you down, your suffering would be prolonged just enough to ensure it became a story people whispered about for years. And in many cases, the outcome was already decided before the first question was asked. You could tell them nothing and still end up in the same place, the executioner's block, the gallows, or the pyre. Some assassins tried to prepare themselves for the possibility of capture. They would train to resist certain methods, practicing how to endure pain, how to dislocate a joint themselves to escape chains, how to keep their breathing steady when suffocated. Others carried poison hidden in a tooth or ring, ready to end their life before their captors could force them to talk. It was a grim insurance policy, but in a world where information could kill everyone you knew, sometimes death was the only way to keep your secret safe. The worst torture wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was the waiting. Being locked in a damp, windowless cell, listening to the footsteps of the guards drawing closer, never knowing if they were coming to take you to the chamber or simply to feed you, hearing the screams of other prisoners echo through the corridors, knowing you might be next. The anticipation could rot your mind faster than the iron could crush your bones. Some prisoners broke before the first lash, driven mad by the certainty of what was coming. There was also the cruel efficiency of medieval torture. It didn't require truth to be considered successful. Once you confessed, truthfully or not, their work was done. You could admit to crimes you never committed, accuse people you had never met, and still be punished just the same. The confession was just the final nail, proof to the crowd that you were guilty and deserved whatever fate awaited you. And once the crowd believed it, there was no turning back. Surviving torture, if you somehow didn't mean you escaped its reach. Many who were released were so maimed they could never work again. Fingers crushed beyond use, legs shattered, faces burned or disfigured. You became a warning without having to be dead, a living example of what happened to those who lived in the shadows too long. And even then, survival only bought you a little more time before the next hand came. The knowledge of this constant threat weighed heavily on every decision you made. It wasn't just about avoiding capture, it was about avoiding situations where you could be taken alive at all. Better to fall on your own blade in an alley than to find yourself chained in a lord's dungeon. Because in the dark, in that cold, damp chamber where the walls absorbed every scream, you knew there were fates far worse than death. And for an assassin in the medieval world, that was a truth you carried like a shadow on your back, every moment of every day. Paranoia wasn't a passing mood. It was the state you lived in, a permanent tightening in your chest, a constant awareness that the next shadow might hold the end of you. As a medieval assassin, trust was a luxury you could not afford. Every interaction, no matter how mundane, carried the weight of potential betrayal. Even in moments that seemed safe, a quiet drink in a dim tavern, a whispered conversation in a back alley, you felt the edge of danger pressing in. You didn't just look over your shoulder now and then. You counted footsteps behind you, measured the rhythm of voices in the street, noted which faces turned toward you and which ones made a point of looking away. It began to affect everything you did. You chose where to sit in a tavern, not for comfort, but for advantage, always with your back to a wall, always facing the door, always near an exit. You memorized every route through a neighborhood, not just the main streets, but the narrowest alleys, the gaps between buildings, the rooftops that could be crossed in a hurry. You noticed things others ignored, a door that was ajar when it had been closed an hour before, the smell of smoke from a fire that wasn't there yesterday, the flicker of movement in a window just as you passed below. To anyone else, they were nothing. To you, they were signs, warnings, possibilities you couldn't afford to dismiss. Paranoia made you study people in ways they didn't realize. The way a merchant's hand twitched when you asked a question. The fraction of a second a tavern keeper hesitated before serving you. The glance exchanged between two strangers as you entered a room. Sometimes it was nothing. Most of the time it was nothing, but you learned that the one time you ignored it would be the time it killed you. You couldn't afford to assume kindness was genuine or coincidence was harmless. The truth was that anyone could be bought, persuaded, or threatened into turning against you. Sleep became one of the greatest dangers of all. You never slept deeply, you couldn't. The mind that was always on guard refused to fully shut down. You learned to wake at the slightest noise, to shift position so you could reach a weapon without thinking. You never let someone see where you slept twice. And if you had to stay in the same place for more than one night, you set traps. Thin strings across the floor, a loose tile balanced against the door so it would fall and wake you if someone entered. You lived with the knowledge that rest was a gamble and that every time your eyes closed, the odds might not be in your favor. The worst part was that paranoia didn't just make you careful, it made you ruthless. If someone behaved suspiciously, you didn't have the luxury of confronting them openly or asking for explanations. You cut ties, sometimes violently, before they had the chance to prove whether they were friend or foe. You began to act preemptively, removing threats before they had time to materialize. A glance that lingered too long could be enough to put someone on your list. A question asked in the wrong tone could seal their fate. And with every action, you fed the cycle. You made more enemies, which justified more paranoia, which led to more blood. Paranoia also bled into the smallest moments of daily life. You avoided drinking too much water at once for fear it might be poisoned. You carried your own cup and never let it leave your hand. You wouldn't eat food that had been out of your sight, even if it meant going hungry. Crowds became traps, not because of their noise or chaos, but because anyone could brush past you with a blade, a needle, or a drop of poison. You began to prefer the silence of empty streets, even though you knew they carried dangers of their own. In time, you realized that paranoia had stolen something more precious than safety. It had stolen your ability to feel human. Every face became a mask, every word a possible deception. You couldn't enjoy a laugh, a song, or a warm meal without searching for the hidden threat within it. You became a creature apart, someone who saw the world only through layers of suspicion. And while it kept you alive, it also hollowed you out, leaving little behind but the instinct to survive. This constant vigilance was exhausting, but letting it slip even for a moment could be fatal. You might think you'd spotted every danger only to be undone by the one you didn't see, the person you dismissed as harmless, the detail you overlooked because you were focused on something else. Paranoia didn't just warn you of threats. It reminded you, day after day, that survival was never certain, and that death might come from the one place you thought was safe. And in your world, that was a lesson you could never afford to forget. The scorn of society was not loud, it was quiet, constant, and cutting. As a medieval assassin, you didn't just live outside the law, you lived outside the very fabric of human belonging. To the people in the streets, you were something between a ghost and a disease. They might not know your name, but they knew your type. They could sense it in the way you moved, the way your eyes scanned every shadow, the way you avoided lingering in the open. And when they did know who you were, or even suspected, they treated you as if you carried a curse that could spill onto them at any moment. The church was your greatest enemy in this regard, not because its priests wielded swords, but because they wielded words. In sermons, you were painted as the embodiment of sin, a murderer for hire, an agent of the devil. You were told to your face, if you dared step inside a chapel, that your soul was already condemned. And while you might shrug at such pronouncements, they had power. Villagers refused you shelter. Merchants raised their prices or refused to sell to you, and children were taught to spit when you passed. Every human interaction came wrapped in suspicion or contempt. Even those who operated on the edges of society, the thieves, smugglers, and gamblers, kept you at arm's length. A cut purse might drink with you in a tavern but never share their hideout. A smuggler might take your coin for passage but would not sleep under the same roof. You were dangerous even to the dangerous because your profession came with enemies no one wanted to inherit. To be close to you was to risk being pulled into your shadow, and few were willing to pay that price. Superstition deepened this isolation. In many towns, the belief persisted that those who killed for coin carried a spiritual taint, a stain that could spread through touch or even proximity. Mothers would pull their children closer if you walked by. Innkeepers would burn sage or sprinkle salt where you had sat. Some would mutter prayers under their breath, as if warding off your presence. You might dismiss these gestures as ignorance, but over time, they worked on you, chipping away at your sense of humanity. When the world looks at you as something less than human long enough, you begin to feel it in your bones. Death itself did not free you from this contempt. If your body was discovered after a killing, it was rarely given a proper burial. Instead, it might be hung in a cage on the city walls, left to rot as a warning. In some places, your corpse could be dismembered and the parts displayed in different quarters of the city, each one a message to others of your kind. The dishonor followed you beyond life, ensuring that even in death, you remained an object of scorn, not pity. And yet, for all the public hatred, there was an unspoken hypocrisy. The same lords and merchants who condemned you in public would send for you in secret when they needed a problem solved discreetly. They would denounce you from the pulpit in the morning and hand you a purse of gold in the evening. This duality was perhaps the most bitter part of your existence. You were despised not because of what you did, but because you reminded them of the filth their own hands were too delicate to touch. Still, the stigma shaped every part of your life. You could never build a true home, because a home could be burned down by neighbors who feared your presence. You could never openly celebrate a festival, because one drunken word could expose you. You could not even show gratitude when someone helped you, because your thanks might mark them in the eyes of others. The assassin's life was a constant balancing act between invisibility and survival, and society made sure you never forgot which side of the line you stood on. Over time, the contempt became a kind of armor. If you were already hated, you had nothing to lose by embracing the role they assigned you. You stopped seeking approval, stopped craving kindness, stopped believing there was any way back into the fold. You became what they feared, not out of choice, but because the path back to their world had been sealed long ago. And when you no longer cared about their acceptance, you could walk through their streets like a shadow, untouched by their words, knowing that the only opinion that mattered now was your own. But even then, the isolation carved by their scorn never truly healed. You might stand in a crowded market, surrounded by hundreds of people, and still feel entirely alone. You might hear laughter spilling from a tavern and know, without question, that it was a sound meant for others, never for you. And in those moments, when the weight of their judgment pressed against you, you understood the most dangerous truth of all, that the hatred of society could kill you just as surely as any blade, only slower, cutting away at you piece by piece until there was nothing left worth saving. Betrayal within the guild was not a rare misfortune. It was a natural part of the life. In the medieval underworld, alliances were not forged from loyalty, but from mutual convenience, and convenience could change in the space of a single heartbeat. An assassin's guild was less a brotherhood and more a marketplace of skill and opportunity, where every member weighed every interaction by its profit and risk. You might share wine with someone one night, swap intelligence on a target the next, and still wake to find your name sold for a handful of silver. The danger came from the fact that your fellow assassins knew you in ways no one else did. They knew your methods, your habits, your preferred weapons. They knew the safe houses you favored, the taverns you trusted, the ways you moved through the streets when you didn't think you were being followed. And because they shared your trade, they could anticipate your reactions with a precision that outsiders never could. If an enemy lord hired one of them to remove you, the contract would be all the more deadly because it came from someone who already knew how to kill you. Information was the most valuable currency in the guild, and it could be traded as easily as gold. A whispered detail about your latest job could find its way into the ears of someone who wanted you gone. A single slip, mentioning a time you would be in a certain district, revealing you had accepted a lucrative contract, could become the thread that unraveled your entire existence. Sometimes the betrayal was not even personal. A guild member might sell your location simply to buy favor with a more powerful client or to erase their own debts. In that world, your life might be worth less than the price of a fine cloak or a cask of wine. The guild leadership, if such a thing could be trusted, played its own dangerous games. They controlled the flow of contracts, deciding who would take which job. A high-paying kill could be given to someone they favored, while you might be sent on a dangerous, low-reward task meant to weaken or eliminate you. If they suspected you were becoming too skilled, too independent, or too ambitious, they could arrange for your downfall without ever lifting a blade themselves. Sometimes this was done by pairing you with a partner whose true purpose was to lead you into a trap. Other times, they simply forgot to warn you about certain details that would have kept you alive. Partnerships within the guild were fraught with tension. On the surface, working together increased your odds of success. In reality, it meant sharing the reward, and the temptation to claim it all by removing the partner was ever present. A staged accident, a silent blade in the dark, a delayed warning during an ambush, many assassins met their end not at the hands of their target, but of the person they had trusted to watch their back. And because assassins were expected to die young, such incidents rarely raised suspicion. Trust, then, became a rare and dangerous thing. You learned to measure it in moments rather than years. You could trust a partner for an hour if the job was in their interest, perhaps for a night if the reward was too great to jeopardize, but you never trusted anyone enough to tell them where you would be tomorrow, and you certainly never revealed where you kept your earnings or your escape routes. The guild taught you to look at every relationship as temporary, every alliance as fragile, every word as a potential weapon that could be turned against you. The paranoia this bred was corrosive. You began to test people constantly, feeding them false information just to see where it resurfaced, changing your patterns to catch anyone tailing you, setting traps in your own hideouts to see if they were disturbed. And when you did uncover betrayal, the guild had its own brutal way of dealing with it. Public executions within the ranks were rare, not because they didn't happen, but because they were often disguised as the natural hazards of the trade. A betrayal might be avenged by sending the traitor on an impossible mission, or by leaking their name to the very enemies they had sold out. Justice in this world was just another form of strategy. And yet, the most dangerous betrayals were the ones you never saw coming. The guild fostered a culture of shared suffering. You drank together after bloody jobs, you patched each other's wounds, you told stories in low voices about close escapes. These moments could feel genuine, almost like family, and that was precisely why they were so deadly. A knife in the dark from an enemy was expected. From a friend, it was devastating not just to the body, but to the soul. In a profession where death was a constant companion, betrayal was the only thing that could truly take you by surprise. Still, you stayed in the guild because the alternative, working entirely alone, was often worse. At least within its walls, betrayal was predictable in its unpredictability. You knew it would come eventually, you simply didn't know when. And in that strange, twisted logic, there was a kind of comfort. You could prepare for a knife in the back when you knew everyone was holding one, but the moment you forgot that truth, the moment you began to believe that someone's loyalty was stronger than their ambition, you had already signed your own death warrant. Disease and injury were constant companions for a medieval assassin, lurking as silently as any enemy in the dark. The danger didn't only come from the point of a blade or the snap of a bowstring, it seeped in through the smallest cut, hid in the air you breathed, and lingered in the water you drank. Medicine as you know it today didn't exist, and the line between a wound and a death sentence was perilously thin. You could escape the best armed guards in the city, slip away from the deadliest bounty hunter, and still be brought down by an infection that began as nothing more than a scratch on your hand. Weapons in your trade were rarely clean. A blade that had pierced one man could carry the rot of his blood into your own body. Arrowheads, reused and unwashed, often left splinters of rust in the wound, turning flesh dark and feverish. Even your own tools, daggers hidden in boots, garrots coiled beneath your tunic, were exposed to sweat, grime, and the filth of the streets. A single careless nick while sharpening a weapon could become a festering sore within days. And when fever set in, it didn't matter how skilled you were or how fast you could run. You became slower, weaker, easier to catch. Poisons, while a vital part of your arsenal, carried their own risks. Many were mixed in secret, using plants and minerals whose effects weren't fully understood even by those who swore mastery over them. A poorly measured dose could sicken you as much as your target. Simply breathing in the fumes of certain preparations could burn your lungs or leave you dizzy and unfocused at the very moment you needed precision. Some assassins prided themselves on testing new toxins, but the unspoken truth was that such experiments claimed nearly as many killers as they did victims. The environments you worked in were breeding grounds for illness. Medieval cities stank of waste, human and animal alike, pouring into open gutters that fed directly into rivers and wells. Rats and fleas carried plague through the streets, striking without warning. You might return from a job to find an entire district sealed off, the people inside dying in droves from a sickness that had no cure. Rural areas offered no safer refuge. Marshes carried fevers that could shake your body until your teeth rattled, while cold, damp forests could sap your strength in silence until pneumonia set in. Injuries were just as relentless. Scaling walls left you with twisted ankles and strained muscles. Grappling with a target in close quarters often meant taking your own share of blows. And while a cut or bruise might seem minor, there were no sterile bandages or antiseptics to keep them clean. Wounds were wrapped in cloth that had already seen a dozen other uses, sometimes packed with whatever herbs were on hand, whether they helped or not. The wrong treatment could trap the infection inside, swelling the flesh until it had to be cut away with a knife, and without any form of pain relief beyond a rag to bite down on. The absence of reliable healers made matters worse. Physicians were few, expensive, and often guided by superstition rather than knowledge. Bloodletting was prescribed for fevers, leeches for swelling, and prayers for wounds that clearly needed stitching. Many assassins relied instead on unofficial healers, midwives, herbalists, or other criminals who had picked up fragments of medical skill. These people could sometimes work miracles, but they could also make fatal mistakes, mistaking a lethal infection for something that could be cured with a poultice and rest. And rest was a luxury you rarely had. Even when injured, you couldn't stay in one place long enough for proper healing. Every day spent recovering was another day for enemies to track your trail. You learned to move with pain, to fight through the stiffness, to climb with blood soaking through your bandages. The more you ignored the injury, the more it became part of you, reshaping the way you moved, the way you fought. Some assassins carried permanent limps or could no longer raise an arm fully, scars that weren't just marks of survival, but constant reminders of how close they had come to being ended by something as small as a misstep or a dirty blade. The psychological strain of living with this risk was heavy. You could plan for a fight, anticipate a trap, even negotiate your way out of danger, but you couldn't negotiate with rot spreading under your skin. There was no bargaining with fever, no convincing a cough to spare you during a silent approach, and worst of all, illness made you vulnerable in a way nothing else could. It stripped away your edge, dulled your senses, and made every shadow seem closer, every sound sharper. In the end, disease and injury were like silent assassins of their own, patient, relentless, and immune to the tricks you used on human prey. They didn't need to chase you through the streets or face you in the dark. They waited inside you, hidden until it was too late. And in a life already filled with enemies you could see, It was often the unseen ones that proved the most deadly. Guilt, when it came, didn't strike like a sudden blow. It crept in slowly, like damp seeping through the stones of a cellar. At first, you told yourself there was nothing to feel guilty about. This was the life you had chosen, the work you had mastered. Death was your trade, and the people you killed were often just names on parchment, strangers whose faces you didn't know until the moment you saw them in the flesh. You convinced yourself that detachment was a kind of armor. But armor has cracks, and over time, guilt found its way through them. The moments that haunted you weren't always the dramatic ones. Sometimes they were painfully small, a pair of shoes left at the door of a home you'd entered by force. The smell of bread, still warm on a table where the target had been eating before you struck. The half-finished letter on a desk, ink still wet, with words meant for someone who would never read them. You didn't think about them in the moment, you couldn't afford to, but later, in the stillness of the night, they returned, vivid and sharp, more real than the kill itself. Some deaths carried no weight at all, and that was its own kind of horror. You would kill a man and feel nothing, not even satisfaction. His life ended, and yours went on, untouched. The absence of emotion was supposed to be strength, but it began to feel like a hollowness that spread further each time. You caught yourself wondering if this emptiness was permanent, if there would come a day when you could no longer feel anything at all. Not joy, not grief, not even fear. The guilt deepened when the job touched the edges of innocence. A target might not be alone when you found them. They could be with a child, a spouse, a parent. Sometimes they begged you to spare the others, and sometimes the job demanded you didn't. Even when you left those others alive, you knew what you had taken from them. You could see it in their faces, the shock, the disbelief, the moment they realized the world would never be safe again. You became part of their nightmares, a shadow they would remember for the rest of their lives. You learned that guilt had strange ways of showing itself. It didn't always come as remorse. Sometimes it came as rage. Rage at the one who gave the order. Rage at the target for making you do it. Rage at yourself for feeling anything at all. You might drink to dull it, lose yourself in the chaos of the city, throw yourself into more work just to drown out the memory of the last job. But no matter how many steps you took, the guilt followed, silent and steady, waiting for a moment when you were too tired to fight it. Some assassins tried to justify their actions by creating their own rules, only killing those they deemed deserving, refusing contracts on women or children, insisting on quick deaths instead of slow ones. But the truth was that these rules were just lines drawn in the sand, and the tide of necessity washed them away sooner or later. Hunger, desperation, or the threat of death made compromises inevitable. And once you crossed your own line, the guilt didn't just return, it multiplied. Because now you had to live with the knowledge that even your self-imposed morality was fragile. There were nights when guilt became a physical thing, pressing on your chest, making it hard to breathe. You might wake from a dream convinced you still had blood on your hands, even if you had washed them hours ago. Sometimes you would hear the voices of those you had killed, not words exactly, but tones, fragments, the sound of breath cut short. You knew they weren't real, but in the quiet, when the rest of the world was sleeping, they felt real enough. The most dangerous part of guilt was that it could slow you down. In this life, hesitation meant death, and guilt had a way of planting hesitation deep in your bones. A target might look at you in a certain way, and for just a fraction of a second, you would falter. That moment was all it took for a blade to turn in your direction. You learned to bury guilt quickly, to shove it down where it couldn't interfere, but burying it didn't make it disappear. It only made it heavier, a weight you carried until it bent you low. And yet, for all its dangers, guilt was also proof you were still human. The day it vanished completely, you knew you'd be no different from the lords and rulers who saw human lives as tools to be used and discarded. But holding on to that last shred of humanity came at a price. In a world where survival meant hardening yourself against every emotion, guilt was both a curse and a reminder, one that never let you forget the faces of the dead, no matter how many shadows you walked through to avoid them. Being forgotten was not a fear. It was a certainty you carried from the first moment you took a life for coin. In the medieval world, the dead were remembered through songs, stories, and the carved stones of graveyards. But assassins didn't leave behind ballads or epitaphs. Your name was never meant to echo through history. It was meant to vanish, swallowed by the silence you had lived in all along. The very skills that kept you alive, the ability to move unseen, to erase traces of your presence, ensured that when you were gone, nothing of you would remain. You might imagine that the ones you killed would carry your memory in their final moments, but even that wasn't certain. Many never saw your face. A blade in the dark, a poisoned cup, a slip from a rooftop. They died not knowing who ended them, only that they had been marked, and those who did see you often had no one to tell. Their words ended with their breath, their memory of you fading into the air before the body cooled. You were the ghost in someone else's story, and ghosts, over time, become nothing more than whispers no one bothers to repeat. Even your employers had no interest in remembering you once your usefulness was spent. A lord might have praised your precision when you delivered his enemy's head, but he wouldn't etch your name into the annals of his family's triumphs. At best, You'd be referred to vaguely a man of skill or the shadow who struck when called upon. At worst, they would deny you ever existed, claiming your work as their own cunning or their own divine fortune. The more valuable your role in shaping events, the more dangerous it was for anyone to admit you had played it. The places you passed through offered no anchors for memory. An innkeeper might remember a quiet guest for a few days before the face blurred into all the others. A stable boy might recall that you paid in silver, but not enough to recall your name. The streets themselves, those twisting veins of stone and dirt, had seen too many footsteps to remember yours. You became part of the flow, moving through the city without leaving a ripple. Even the ones who noticed you in the moment forgot you by the time they reached home. Some assassins tried to fight this fate in small ways. They left marks carved into beams above doorways, symbols scratched into the underside of tables, initials hidden in the mortar between stones. But these were not memorials. They were warnings or secret messages for others in the trade. And when the building fell, the table burned, or the wall crumbled, the marks vanished along with the memory of the hand that made them. A life lived in secrecy meant the erasure began long before death ever claimed you. The only stories that sometimes lingered were the exaggerated ones, twisted by rumor and fear. You might be remembered as a faceless monster, a demon in human form who could pass through walls or kill with a glance. But these tales had no truth in them. They were weapons wielded by others to frighten or control. The real you, the one who bled, who limped after a fall, who stared too long into a cup of wine after a job, was gone from the telling. And perhaps that was the cruelest part. The world would remember the shadow, but not the person who cast it. Death itself sealed the final erasure. Without family to claim your body or mourn at your grave, you were disposed of as the city saw fit. In some places, that meant burial in an unmarked pit outside the churchyard, where thieves, paupers, and plague victims lay tangled together in anonymity. In others, your body might simply be burned to prevent disease, the ashes scattered without ceremony. There would be no stone for someone to stumble upon centuries later, no inscription to puzzle over. Even the earth would not keep you. And yet, there was a strange kind of symmetry in this fate. Just as you had taken lives without leaving traces, so too would your own life be erased without a sound. The world would go on unchanged, markets would open, bells would toll, and no one would pause to note your absence. The void you left would close in an instant, as if you had never walked its streets at all. In the end, the knowledge of this inevitability shaped you as much as any blade or poison. It stripped away any illusions of legacy, forcing you to accept that survival was not about being remembered. It was about existing in the present moment, one breath at a time, until the breath was gone. And perhaps, somewhere in that grim acceptance was the final lesson every assassin learned, that being forgotten was not just the end of your story, but the perfect continuation of the life you had always lived, in silence, in shadow, and unseen. Redemption was the one thing the life of a medieval assassin refused to offer. It wasn't just that the church damned your soul, or that the law marked you as an enemy of all men. It was that the world itself provided no road back. Once you had taken coin for killing, the stain never washed away. No matter how many years you survived, or how many good deeds you tried to scatter in your wake. You could disappear into another town, change your name, take up a trade, even marry and have children. But the past had a way of finding you, like the shadow of a blade that never stopped trailing across your neck. The church was merciless in its stance. Priests spoke in absolutes. Murderers for hire were beyond forgiveness unless they renounced their life entirely and submitted themselves to the harshest penance. And even then, penance often meant imprisonment, exile, or death. Confession could save your soul, they said, but it could not save your life. The paradox was cruel. Seeking redemption meant exposing yourself to the very punishment you had spent your life evading. Many assassins never dared set foot in a chapel for fear that the wrong ear would hear their whispered sins and pass word to the city guard. Society, too, had no interest in granting you a second chance. A thief might be welcomed back after years away if he returned with coin and kept his hands clean. A deserter might be forgiven if he proved himself in battle again. But an assassin? No, you were not seen as a man who had made mistakes. You were seen as the embodiment of deliberate, calculated evil. Even if you saved a child from drowning or defended a village from bandits, gratitude could turn to fear the moment your past was revealed. Good deeds could not balance the scales. The weight of the lives you had taken crushed any hope of earning back trust. Some tried to escape their past by vanishing into far-off lands. They would change their name, adopt the dress and customs of strangers, and bury their weapons deep in the earth. But memories are harder to bury than steel. A familiar scar, an old contact recognizing your face, a whispered rumor brought by a passing merchant, it was enough to unravel the new life in an instant. And when the truth emerged, the townspeople who once welcomed you could turn overnight into a mob driven by fear of what you had been rather than respect for what you had become. Others sought redemption through service, offering their skills to causes they believed just. They became bodyguards for the defenseless, hunters of criminals worse than themselves, soldiers in wars where the enemy was painted as unquestionably wicked. But here, too, redemption proved elusive. The lines between right and wrong blurred quickly on the battlefield, and before long, the assassin's habits crept back. A job done for honor began to look suspiciously like a contract for coin. The difference between serving a noble cause and falling back into the old trade was so thin it could vanish without you even noticing. The mind itself was another prison. Even if no one else judged you, you still judged yourself. The faces of the dead lingered in dreams. Their voices, imagined or remembered, slipped into moments of quiet. You told yourself you could change, that you could live clean, but the part of you that had thrived in the shadows, the part that had survived by killing, was still there, patient and ready. When danger arose, your instincts didn't turn to mercy. They reached for the blade, and each time you used it, no matter how justified you told yourself it was, the path back to redemption slipped further away. Rumors among assassins told of rare cases, men or women who truly left the life and lived out their days in peace. But these stories were always secondhand, always without proof. More often than not, when you dug deeper, you found that the so-called redemption ended in a shallow grave, a betrayal, or a sudden disappearance that left more questions than answers. In your world, the ones who vanished cleanly were either the dead or those who had become something even worse to survive. The cruelest truth was that redemption wasn't denied by fate, it was denied by choice. To seek it fully meant lowering your guard, stepping out of the shadows and trusting the world not to strike you down the moment you did. And for an assassin, trust was a muscle long since withered. You had spent years expecting betrayal, avoiding vulnerability, living with the certainty that mercy was a weapon others would turn against you. The idea of putting down the blade, of walking openly in the daylight, felt less like salvation and more like suicide. So you stayed where you were, circling in the same narrow orbit between survival and damnation. The thought of redemption lingered at the edge of your mind, a distant light you might have once believed in. But in the life you had chosen, or the life that had chosen you, there was no road leading to it. Only the endless turning of the wheel, the shadow under the torchlight, and the knowledge that some paths, once taken, can never be walked back. And perhaps the most chilling part was realizing that somewhere deep down, you no longer knew if you would take that road even if it did exist.